Hi, I'm Zaylee, and welcome to my Rhombocosa dodecahedron of interests. Today we're in the science fiction corner with some Star Trek. I've been watching Star Trek pretty much since I was 3 years old, and my parents are huge fans of the show, so it was only natural that when they had kids, they would show it to us. At the time, only Star Trek The Next Generation and some of the original Trek movies were available on DVD, but eventually my parents' collection grew to include every season of every series, and I watched all of them. As a kid, I was so obsessed with Star Trek that I desperately wanted to go to Starfleet Academy instead of college when I grew up, because I don't think a part of me had quite processed that Starfleet Academy did not in fact exist. When I was a teenager, I tried to teach myself Vulcan, unsuccessfully, because Vulcan is not a fully fleshed out language, unlike Klingon, which I probably actually should have tried to learn, but who needs to learn Klingon when you have Socratic space elves? I used to be such a Star Trek trivia whiz that I had all the original Trek episode titles memorized. I don't anymore, but I still know enough to know one thing. If I were born in the Star Trek universe, I would 100% be a conspiracy theorist. One of the fun things about the original series of Star Trek is it uses a lot of allusions and references to history and mythology. And like a lot of other science fiction from that time, it isn't really subtle about it. Probably the most blatant is the Vulcans and the Romulans. The name Vulcan comes from the Roman god of the same name, though he's probably better known by his Greek name, Hephaestus. He was a blacksmith whose forge was in a volcano, and his name is the origin of the word volcano. One of the ways we can see the connection is that the planet Vulcan is hot and arid, so it makes sense to make a reference to a god associated with fire and heat. Another connection is that while Vulcan is the Roman name, the god is originally Greek, and the Vulcans are very Greek-inspired, from their use of logic and stoicism to the fact that their heart is located where the human liver should be. The Romulans, of course, are based on the ancient Romans. Their planet Romulus is literally named after one of the founders of Rome, and everything from their culture to their clothes to their political structure is based on ancient Rome. One of the Star Trek writers who created the Romulans literally said his basis for them was the idea, what would the Roman Empire look like if it had developed to the point of space travel? Even more than this is their relationship to the Vulcans. If Romulans are Romans, then this definitely solidifies the Vulcans as the Greeks. Much like how the first Romans broke off from the Greeks as told in the fictionalized account of the Aeneid, the first Romulans were just Vulcans who didn't agree with Vulcan stoicism and left to colonize Romulus. While these allusions to Greek and Roman history and myth are fun for us as the audience, they don't make much sense in universe. Why would an alien civilization name themselves after a human myth? The short answer is they wouldn't. However, let me give you a logical, rational, and reasonable explanation for why they might be named after human stories, and then let me explain why my very good explanation is not correct. Something humans are very good at is bias. We like to frame new things we see with reference to things we've already experienced, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Making inferences about things based on past experience is just one of the ways we process the world around us. But it can be a problem if your frame of reference is too rigid and you're unwilling to learn. You can't just assume that things are going to be the same everywhere, and you shouldn't project the way things are for you on other people just because you feel like it. And yet, this is something people have been doing for forever. We often center things around our own frame of reference and change things to fit that narrative. A good example of this is that many ancient cultures, when faced with the gods of another culture, would assume both sets of gods were the same and that theirs were the correct gods. They would see any gods with similarities to one of their gods and assume they were their gods being worshipped under another name. It's why we have the Greeks assuming their god Hermes is the same as the Roman Mercury, the Celtic Lu, or the Norse Odin. Perhaps a better and more relevant example is when people completely ignore what a place is called by its native people and give it a name based on themselves or their culture or their preconceived notions about the place. After all, the Caribbean definitely wasn't called the West Indies by its native inhabitants. America is based in Italian rather than any native language, and my personal favorite, California, is literally named after a mythical island in a Spanish story. We like to give names to things that already have names, and this is what could have happened with the Vulcans and the Romulans. Instead of calling them and their planets by their actual names, humans could have decided to call them something else. Humans could have seen how the Vulcans and Romulans resembled the Greeks and the Romans and decided to be like, so we know you guys have names, which we totally didn't forget and definitely can pronounce, but we're going to call you this instead because it's a thing from human history and you remind us of that. And the thing is that if Star Trek canonized something like this, it would be amazing and would fill in this world-building plot hole very well. Except they can't do that without contradicting themselves. Not that they haven't done that before, but the goal here is not to create more plot holes. In order for humans to assign the Romulans this name, they would need to know about their culture, or at least about how they are related to the Vulcans. The problem is that until the episode Balance of Terror, the humans knew none of this. Due to the nature of space travel, humans had never actually seen Romulans before despite fighting an entire war against them. This is especially relevant to the episode because with Romulans being descended from Vulcans, they look a lot like them, and many members of the crew began to turn on Spock, who they were worried was actually a Romulan spy. Because humans have been calling them Romulans since before this encounter, we can assume that this is actually what they are called, or at the very least, what the Vulcans call them, since we can assume it's likely that the Vulcans would have given them the information if the Romulans didn't themselves. And speaking of the Vulcans, while it's possible that humans could have given them that name, since they do know about Vulcan culture and their planet and such, I think it's unlikely. Vulcans are canonically the first aliens the humans ever met, and while humans are definitely like that, I doubt we would be disrespectful enough to not use their name, considering just how many stories we have of alien invaders. As nice as the Vulcans can be, who's to say we couldn't make them angry enough to invade us? They did have a violent history after all. When Zefram Cochrane, creator of the first successful human-made warp drive and unwitting first ambassador of Earth, met with the first Vulcans humanity had ever seen, I can't imagine he was told anything other than Vulcan when asking what they were called. While this explanation doesn't work, there is another possible explanation they could have used, which also doesn't work. But it is fun to talk about. This explanation is something I'm going to call convergent etymology because I couldn't find out what it is actually called. Basically, it's when two words sound the same while being from two unrelated languages, and it comes in two categories: homonyms and false cognates. The homonym type of convergent etymology is the most common because there is a limit to how many distinct mouth sounds humans can make if we don't factor in tone or volume. From what I could find, most languages include an average of about 50 basic sounds, but overall there are a few hundred. If you include tone and volume, the possible distinct mouth sounds are potentially infinite, but neither are part of what makes a homonym. Two words that sound similar but are pronounced with different intonation are still homonyms. It's possible that humanoid aliens would be able to make a similar range of sounds as humans due to similarities in the structures of their throats, mouths, tongues, etc. And with a similar range of mouth sounds comes the possibility of similarly sounding words. There's actually even a good example of this already in the Star Trek universe with the Klingons. Their home planet of Kronos is pronounced like Kronos, which is a name of one of the Greek titans. Despite sounding the same, the two words clearly mean two different things and come from two different sources. The cultures the two words are from are also notably different, with the Klingons being more reminiscent of Vikings and samurai than the ancient Greeks. It's fairly easy to believe that the two words were invented independently of each other. The second type of convergent etymology, false cognates, is the type Vulcans and Romulans are more likely to be, even though it is the rarer type. Cognates are words that sound similar and have a similar meaning because they come from the same original word. False cognates, meanwhile, are words that sound similar and have a similar meaning but aren't related to each other at all. Probably my favorite example is that the English word dog sounds similar to and has the same meaning as the word for dog in an Aboriginal Australian language, which is apparently pronounced differently, but I don't know how and I don't want to get it wrong, so I'm just going to say dog. Considering that the English first encountered Australia in the 1770s, there's no way the two could be related. Another example is the Japanese word arigato and the Portuguese word obrigado, which both essentially mean thank you. It's technically possible that we could have a case of false cognates, but this only really applies to the word Romulan since it sounds like Roman and has a similar meaning of a person from this specific place. The rest are more thematically similar than having a direct similar meaning. It's for this reason that this explanation doesn't really work either. Sure, it's possible it's just a coincidence, but coincidence can only get you so far. There are just so many overlapping elements between these alien words and cultures with ancient Earth civilizations that the probability of it just being a coincidence is low. Not impossible, but very low. This is why, if I existed in the Star Trek universe, I would be a conspiracy theorist. I may be looking at everything with the knowledge that this is a work of fiction that takes influence from our world, and that definitely helps in pinpointing these improbabilities, but I don't need this meta-knowledge to know something is off. While I did do a little bit of Googling for some of the etymology terms, everything else I already knew due to a lifelong interest in mythology and the history of ancient cultures, as well as a recent interest in etymology. I can't imagine that an alternate version of me from the Star Trek universe wouldn't also be fascinated by these things, and I don't think it's a leap to imagine that I would make similar connections. That being said, while I know I'd be able to tell that something is wrong, I don't know if I'd be able to figure out why the similarities exist. Even from the vantage point where this is a work of fiction, I'm hard-pressed to figure it out. Was there earlier contact between Vulcans and humans? Did Vulcans or Romulans secretly control or at least influence ancient Greek and Rome? Maybe this shows proof of some sort of god or divine creator or incredibly powerful alien. Is this just due to Q? I feel like Q's a pretty good catch-all for this kind of thing, and I don't really have a better explanation. Honestly, I'm not a very good conspiracy theorist, and maybe that's okay.